Welcome. Today we'll be talking about Chapter 29 from AMSCO AP US History. Chapter 29 is called The Limits of a Superpower. It's all about the presidency of Richard Nixon in the 1970s and the ultimate defeat of the US in the Vietnam War, which shows the limits that the US has, the weaknesses that they have as they lose the Vietnam War. This is one of the last lectures, probably the second to last lecture that we'll have. So we are very quickly approaching the end of this course. You'll see how I've got my notes set up here, talking mostly about the Vietnam War, the context of the war, the causes with the Tonkin Gulf incident, and then the war itself, some key terms and strategies that both sides use. We'll look at the protests in America, the end of the war itself, and then digging into Richard Nixon as president himself, some of his domestic policies, but then also Watergate and his resignation. So that's where we're headed. Starting first by talking about Vietnam. Vietnam is in what used to be called French Indochina. It was originally a French colony, south of China, east of India, north of the Philippines, right there. And Vietnam gained independence from France in 1954 as part of the broader movement of decolonization after World War II. Like a lot of former colonies in this era, Vietnam was cut in half. North Vietnam was communist, led by Ho Chi Minh, and they received support from the normal communist heavy hitters, Soviet Union and China. And the South was South Vietnam was turned into a republic, led by Dinh Diem, supported by the U.S. So just like we saw in Korea, and really like we saw in Germany as well, country gets cut in half after World War II. One side becomes communist, one side becomes democratic. And we can already imagine that there's going to be a war brewing between these two halves. In the 1950s and 1960s, there's a gradual escalation. I should say, first, Vietnam defeated France in war, in battle. This was not a peaceful decolonization movement. And so there was already a war between Europe and Vietnam, between France and Vietnam. In the late 50s with President Eisenhower, and then the early 60s with President Kennedy, there's a gradual escalation, a gradual increase in US support. Eisenhower follows kind of a Marshall Plan-esque policy here, where he gives $1 billion in economic aid and military aid to the South. But that military aid was mostly weapons and like advisors, not necessarily boots on the ground. Kennedy continues that trend, sending 16,000 troops to the South. But again, it says those are our troops in non-combat roles. That means they're going to be advisors. They're not going to be fighting the war for South Vietnam, but they're going to be perhaps training the South Vietnamese people. And so with our context here, Vietnam gained independence from France in 1954, and it split into two, just like we've seen before. There's a communist North and a democratic South, essentially. And the US gradually increases support to the South. There's economic aid, and there's military advisors, let's say. No boots on the ground yet. That will change in August of 1964 with what is known as the Tonkin Gulf incident. So in 1964, South Vietnam had a chaotic year, 6 different governments in 1964. One of those was a revolution that we supported because we weren't happy with Dinh Diem and his support that he had been giving the US. So there's just this revolving door of governments in Vietnam. And then in August 1964, what is known as the Tonkin Gulf incident. The Gulf of Tonkin is up here, North Vietnam. A US warship is allegedly fired upon in the Gulf of Tonkin. And at the time, the US believed that their warship was fired upon by a North Vietnamese gunboat. Now, historians to this day dispute that claim. Most historians think actually either the American ship was not fired upon or it wasn't by North Vietnam. The US doesn't care, just like we saw in the Spanish-American War with the USS Maine, where the US blamed Spain for attacking us, but really it was just like an engine explosion. The US doesn't care. They passed the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, which gives this is LBJ at this point, because JFK had been killed in 63. President Johnson is basically given a blank check to take, quote, all necessary measures to protect US interests in Vietnam. And so the Tonkin Gulf incident, the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, opened the door for the US to drastically increase their involvement in the US, again, under the guise of both protecting US interests and under the guise of containing communism. So again, we have the Tonkin Gulf incident in 1964. A US ship is fired upon in the Gulf of Tonkin by North Vietnam. I'm gonna put a question mark there, like, were we actually fired upon by North Vietnamese ship? Historians kind of debate that, but that was the argument at least. And then Congress gives LBJ a blank check to protect US interests. And then again, the main goal here is to contain communism, containment, and to protect US interests as well. So the Vietnam War really becomes a war of North Vietnam. The communists, called the Viet Cong, led by Ho Chi Minh, supported by the Soviet Union and China, against the South Vietnam, which I put democracy in quotation marks because the US has a long history of supporting dictators that are friendly to us, and that was sometimes the case in South Vietnam. But anti-communist, pro-US dictator, I guess, which the US is okay with. Early on in the war, this is this first phase of the Vietnam War is sometimes called Americanization. It's the Americanization of the war, where the US gets drastically involved in the war and drastically increases their presence in Vietnam. This starts with Operation Rolling Thunder in 1965, which was prolonged, constant air attacks, bombing raids against the North. You can see one photograph of just the amount of bombs that they would drop onto North Vietnam. And then this graph shows us the very quick escalation or increase of troops sent to Vietnam. Remember, under JFK, there were 16,000 advisors by 1965, and you can see that here, 63, 64, there's barely anybody. But after Tonkin Gulf, we have 184,000 troops in 1965, 485,000 troops 2 years later, and 540,000 troops 2 years after that. The peak seems to be 1968 with over 500,000 troops. And so the US very quickly increases their involvement. So we'll say the US quickly escalates their involvement in Vietnam in the 1960s, let's say, actually, I'm gonna say late 60s. We have Operation Rolling Thunder, which is bombing raids on the North. And then there's a huge increase in number of troops, 540,000 troops in 1969. So the US fully invested, whether the American people like it or not, fully invested in the Vietnam War by the turn of the decade. The US strategy in Vietnam was quite brutal, and it involved a lot of chemical warfare, which today is banned, today is illegal, and really at the time, chemical warfare was illegal, and the US kind of found some loopholes here to use chemical weapons against the Vietnamese people. Agent Orange, which was a pesticide, it was used on crops to kill pests. Today it's known to cause cancer and birth defects, so lots of Vietnamese people today or born in the last 40 years or so have been born with kind of mutations on their face, I guess. And then napalm, which was highly flammable sticky jelly used in bombs that would basically create firestorms that would spread like wildfire and would destroy entire towns and villages and people. And so the US strategy was scorched earth, using chemical weapons to completely destroy the land, to destroy the villages. The Vietnamese strategy, or the Viet Cong strategy, the Viet Cong was the name for the communist North Vietnamese, was oftentimes called guerrilla warfare. Guerrilla warfare is like irregular warfare. It's using surprise attacks. It's using ambushes, hit and run attacks, hiding in the bushes, attacking and then hiding again, arming civilians, things like that. And so the Viet Cong, or the North Vietnamese, they had the home field advantage, if you will, because they were fighting on their turf. They knew where to hide. They knew how to set traps. And they also were protecting their land, and so civilians were willing to take up arms. This guerrilla strategy made it incredibly hard for the American army. Even though the US had far superior technology, they could not root out the Vietnamese. They couldn't find them, obviously. Oftentimes when they could find them, they couldn't eliminate them. And so this strategy of guerrilla warfare by the Viet Cong, by the Vietnamese, really stretches out the war, makes it much deadlier, and prevents the US really from ever becoming successful. One specific attack by the Viet Cong was what's known as the Tet Offensive, that was launched in January of 1968 during the Lunar New Year, when there was supposed to be a ceasefire, or it was, I don't know if there was ever like a formally signed ceasefire, but it was kind of just assumed that there would be a ceasefire for the holidays. And during the New Year, Lunar New Year, the Viet Cong launched a coordinated attack against dozens of southern bases and southern cities and American military bases. And the Tet Offensive was broadcast on television. Journalists and news reporters and TV cameras were there. They had all sorts of footage and firsthand accounts of this, and was televised back home in the US. The Tet Offensive really was a demoralizing blow to US support for the war. The Tet Offensive really hammered home how incredibly deadly and brutal and gruesome the Vietnam War was, both to American troops and to the Vietnamese people. And so what we'll see, this was 1968, we're going to see a huge increase in protests in 1968, 69, and beyond, as the American people begin to turn against the Vietnam War. So when we're talking about the war here, put the US strategy under here. They're using chemical weapons, really. They're using Agent Orange and napalm. But then the Viet Cong strategy is guerrilla warfare. And the Tet Offensive, specifically in 1968, is broadcast on the US news, and it leads to a huge drop in support for the war. Some really famous but also graphic photographs. I should have added, I suppose, a trigger warning before the start of this lecture. You can see helicopters dropping Agent Orange. The effects of bombs in both napalm, and then a young girl who had whose village had been bombed by napalm. Her clothes had become so soaked with these chemicals, with these poisons, that she had to tear off her clothes, literally just to survive. And this is these children coming upon US troops begging for help. This girl is still alive today. She is, what is this? This was in the late 60s. So she's probably about 60 years old. But you know, forever has to live with those scars, both physical and emotional, of the war. The Vietnamese had their Tet Offensive. Sorry, the Viet Cong had their Tet Offensive in 1968. The U.S. also had their fair share of really brutal massacres of the Vietnamese people. Most famously in the My Lai massacre in March of 1968, but this wasn't actually exposed in US papers until 18 months later, in November of '69. In the My Lai massacre, the US Army massacred an entire village, 500 innocent civilians were killed. This is men, women, and children. And for months, for a year and a half, it was covered up by the US government. Now, the official story is that the soldiers didn't know they were attacking an innocent village. They thought they were attacking the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong had been sheltered or protected by these villagers. But you do have to wonder, as you know, the US troops are killing women and children, you have to assume that they knew that they were doing what they were doing. But regardless, this was covered up by the US government. Only one person was convicted, the general who gave the order, and he was given 3.5 years of house arrest. So you can see a family. These photographs taken by the US military. And so, you know, the US military did not think they were doing anything wrong. Whether they thought they were attacking the Viet Cong or whether they thought that they could just get away with it because it was war. The My Lai massacre is one of the biggest stains on recent US history, at least military history. And so the Vietnam War, I mean, what we're seeing here is just one of the most brutal wars that the world had ever seen. World War II was brutal, but the US only fought in World War II. It at least fought in the European theater for about a year. And much of that was, you know, not necessarily broadcast accurately back at home because, you know, we were fighting the Nazis and there was all this war propaganda. But these types of photographs, these types of stories, at least when they were uncovered by the press, these types of stories were covered in all of their gruesome detail back home. It really turned a lot of the US public against the war. Now, amidst this war is a presidential election. Richard Nixon wins the presidency in 1968. LBJ decided not to run for the Democrats. He had served one full term plus a little bit of another term after Kennedy's assassination. And quite tragically, the front runner for the Democratic nominee, Robert F. Kennedy, RFK, JFK's brother, was assassinated in 1968 on the night of the California primary. He was killed at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, Koreatown. Today, there is a LAUSD school that is built on the grounds of the Ambassador Hotel where he was killed. And so the election of 1968, Richard Nixon might have won anyways because there was kind of a backlash against Democratic policies. Democrats had been in power, JFK and LBJ, so for 8 years. But once RFK was killed, Richard Nixon relatively easily won. Which kind of illustrates some frustrations with Democratic policies or just frustrations with the last 8 years. So I'm going to put this down here at the bottom. The Republican Nixon wins the presidency in 1968. You can add those extra details there if you want to about RFK's assassination or like the frustration with the chaos of the 60s. But under Nixon, we see kind of the reverse of what happened under Johnson. Sometimes called the Vietnamization of the war. Now, if the Americanization of the war was very, very quick escalation of U.S. troops, sending 500,000 troops to to Vietnam. Again, when Nixon took office in '69, there were 500,000 American troops in Vietnam. Vietnamization then is the gradual withdrawal of troops and shifting the responsibility to the South Vietnamese, giving them money, giving them weapons, training the South Vietnamese to take over the bulk of the fighting. Nixon oftentimes called this peace with honor. This would be an honorable way to have peace without perhaps some of the bloodshed. This oftentimes came to be known as the Nixon Doctrine. The US will continue to support our Asian allies fighting against communism, but maybe not with ground forces. Maybe more following the Marshall Plan, sending economic aid, or military advisors and things like that. So I am going to add this under the Vietnam War here. Under Richard Nixon, there is the Vietnamization of the war, which basically means that the US gradually withdrew troops and trained the South Vietnamese soldiers to fight it. And I will add this idea of the Nixon Doctrine. The Nixon Doctrine doesn't come up very often in AP exams, but I do think it captures what Nixon is doing here. The US will still support Asian allies to fight communism, but without ground troops, without troops on the ground. Even though the US is pulling troops out of Vietnam, they are still heavily involved. And much of that involves bombing raids. One of many horrible stains on the US's record in Vietnam was their decision to bomb Vietnam. Sorry, their decision to bomb Cambodia, my bad, in 1970, right next door. So you can see here, Richard Nixon pointed at a map of Vietnam and then Cambodia. And there were reports that the Viet Cong, the North Vietnamese troops, were using trails that went from North Vietnam into Cambodia and into South Vietnam, called the Ho Chi Minh Trail sometimes. So there were reports that the Viet Cong were using roads and trails in Cambodia. I'm so sorry. This should say in Cambodia here. I got my names mixed up a little bit. And so Nixon orders the dropping of 110,000 tons of bombs dropped in Cambodia. A ton is 2,000 pounds, so 110,000 tons is 220 million pounds of bombs. This shows us where the bombs were dropped. I mean, the entire eastern half of the country was wiped out. Cambodia is still dealing with this legacy, Vietnam as well, but Cambodia especially still dealing with this legacy of, destroyed countrysides and also unexploded artillery. They're sitting in the middle of farms, and every once in a while, one of them will explode and will, kill or maim a villager, I guess. Now, by this point, so we're looking at 1968, 1969. By this point, it's kind of negative story after negative story after negative story about the US in Vietnam. And US support for the war drops off a cliff. And there started to be a lot of protests against the Vietnam War. Many of these protests were on college campuses because, well, students were oftentimes the ones drafted. And the fact that there were all these protests kind of illustrated what was called a credibility gap. Basically, people did not trust the government. They did not think the government was a credible source of information. They felt like the government had lied to them, from covering up the My Lai massacre to other stories like that. So first, young people especially, didn't trust the government. And then the US heavily used the draft to conscript or to enlist millions of young men to fight. And so this website is always interesting. It kind of shows you, if you were born in 1950, would you have been drafted? And so my dad was born on March 7th, 1950. His draft number was 122, and it was called in 1970. The way the draft worked is that every single, your birthday was given a random number, 1 to 365. And from there, the US government would start with 1, work their way down, find out if you would be drafted. So this was my dad's actual draft number, 122. He was born March 7th, 1950. My dad actually didn't serve in the Vietnam War, but he worked for the US Navy in California. So he kind of did his service, I suppose, without having to actually go to war. but many of his friends from high school and college did go. Now, deferments or exemptions were quite common from the draft, especially for the wealthy and also for the college educated. And so there was oftentimes an incentive to go to college, and oftentimes those college campuses would become kind of the center of anti-war protests. And then the wealthy would be exempted as well. We'll explore a song about that next week called "Fortunate Son" by CCR that kind of explores the people who were born with a silver spoon in their mouth who didn't have to fight. Now, as so many young people, 18 and older, are going to Vietnam to fight, one positive of this, I suppose, was the 26th Amendment, which changed the voting age from 21 to 18. Basically, if you're old enough to die for your country, you should be old enough to fight. Sorry, oh my God. If you're old enough to die for your country, you're old enough to vote. Little Freudian slip there, sorry. But anyways, because of this lack of trust in the government, because of the draft, because of frustration among young people about the war, protests became incredibly common, especially on college campuses. These protests erupted after the My Lai massacre and the bombing of Cambodia. And the most famous instance was at Kent State University, where the National Guard was called in, and the National Guard shot and killed 4 protesters. A similar thing happened, I believe, at Jackson State. Yeah, Jackson State University in Mississippi that killed 2 people. So the Kent State massacre is kind of the most famous example of these anti-war protests, with a horrible consequence for the protesters. So we'll say anti-war protests were very common on college campuses. I'm going to say in the late 60s, 68 especially. So I'll say people did not trust the government. And then I'll say that the draft especially impacted young people. And then the most famous of this, Kent State Massacre, the National Guard kills 4 protesters. Now, a lot of this story of the US's involvement in Vietnam is about the horrible things the US government did, but a lot of the story also is about the role of the media, the role of the press, the role of newspapers in doing investigative journalism to uncover what the US did, what they were covering up. The My Lai massacre was one example of the US media, the US press doing these investigations. Pentagon Papers as well. The Pentagon Papers was the nickname given to a huge set of official government documents that were leaked to the press that exposed basically all of the deception and cover-ups of the US government. It exposed that the US had secretly bombed Cambodia and nearby Laos before the US public was aware of it at all. And the Pentagon Papers also exposed not only did the government have these secret bombing raids, but they also lied to the American people, and they lied to Congress, the president, I should say. And so the Pentagon Papers just continue to increase these anti-war protests as people realize the government has been lying to them, and that credibility gap increases even more. So we'll say Pentagon Papers exposed the US government's kind of lies, deception, secret bombing raids, and it leads to even more protests, even more protests and even less support for the war. And so the war does end pretty soon after that, January of 1973, so a little over a year after the Pentagon Papers were released. It officially ended with an armistice. It officially ended with a ceasefire between North and South Vietnam. But what really happened is the US said, you know what, we're getting out of here. We're going to leave. We're going to let you all hold free elections. This did not end the war. The US simply evacuated. So these photographs here are taken from what is sometimes called the fall of Saigon. Saigon, today Ho Chi Minh City in South Vietnam. This was the US Embassy in South Vietnam, and this was one of the last American helicopters, one of the last American military helicopters to leave Saigon. And there's just this huge rush of people trying to get a ticket out of Vietnam before the US completely left. And so the US pulls out completely. Free elections are technically held in Vietnam. But what ultimately happens is, well, the North keeps on fighting. They conquer the South, and Vietnam becomes communist, the entire country. Vietnam to this day is still officially communist. And so containment failed. I mean, if you look back to some of the US's other involvements in wars during the Cold War, the Korean War technically worked. The Korean War technically contained communism in the North. In Vietnam, we failed. We did not contain communism. In fact, communism spread. So when we talk about the end of the war here, the Paris Peace Accords in 1973, I'm going to say end the war. The US troops evacuate, and they kind of abandon the South. And so North Vietnam conquers the South, and all of Vietnam becomes communist. One of the legacies, there's a few, but one of the legacies of the Vietnam War is the War Powers Act. The War Powers Act basically was an awareness by Congress that the president had gotten too powerful. Now, much of that had been Congress's own fault because of the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, where Congress gave the president, basically a blank check to take all necessary measures to protect the US. Whatever. Congress realizes that the president has gained too much power with war. So the War Powers Act says the president must report to Congress within 48 hours of taking any military action. So any military action, president's got to tell Congress within 48 hours. And then if the president is going to authorize military action longer than 90 days, Congress must approve. This is still officially on the books, although presidents, every single president, including Obama and Trump, have found ways around this by saying, oh, I'm not taking military action. I just launched a military strike against Syria or whatever. So this was an attempt to curb or limit presidential power. And I suppose it did a little bit, but not completely. Richard Nixon here reading the paper saying, imagine Congress trying to curb my right to conduct unconstitutional wars. Why, that's unconstitutional. Kind of pointing out the hypocrisy, I guess, of it all. So the War Powers Act, this limits the US president's power to conduct war, basically. President must report to Congress if they launch a military action. The legacy of the Vietnam War is multifaceted. Should actually add some thoughts here. Kind of legacy of the war. One of the biggest legacies of the war is that the US public kind of loses faith, or maybe loses trust in their government, and also in their military, maybe. We see an increase in support for the US military after 9/11, but yeah, people begin to mistrust the government and mistrust the role of the US around the world. There's also a huge death toll, both military and civilian, for the Vietnamese. And then there is kind of this debate around presidential power. We see increases in presidential power with, the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, with LBJ. We see a decrease in presidential power with the War Powers Act, kind of this back and forth tug and war between the White House and Congress. This is the Vietnam War Memorial in DC, which, if you've ever been there, is probably the most powerful memorial in DC because of its simplicity. It's just a black slab with the names of every single person killed in Vietnam, every American troop, rather. It's, polished black rocks. You can see your reflection and kind of find yourself lost in prayer or thought or whatever you're doing. And the loss of these hundreds of thousands of troops, again, really was a turning point in American support, or lack of support now, for war and military action abroad. And so as we wrap up with Nixon's other policies, including Watergate and his resignation, one of the things that we see is détente, reducing tensions, especially with China. This was sometimes called ping pong diplomacy, because Nixon went to meet Mao Zedong, the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, and there was a ping pong, a table tennis tournament between Americans and Chinese. So it was the idea of using ping pong to engage in diplomacy. Nixon was the first American president to negotiate with communist China. So this was the idea of kind of reducing tensions. As next door in Vietnam, we were fighting this gruesome war. So we'll say that there is détente with China. So there's reduced tensions, and there is more negotiations or more diplomacy. And then economically, back home, Nixon struggled with a recession in the early 70s, something called stagflation. Stagflation is a combination of two words: stagnation, which means the economy doesn't grow, and inflation, which means prices go up. Combine those two together, an economy that doesn't grow and prices that go up, you've got a real tough economy. So Nixon struggled through a recession in the 70s. He tried to, as Republicans oftentimes do, Republicans oftentimes like small federal governments. So he shrank the size of the federal government, and he shifted kind of the cost of like welfare, Great Society programs to the states, which is oftentimes not a good idea. Federal government can oftentimes manage those programs much better than state governments. And then Nixon also came up with kind of a new strategy called the Southern Strategy, where he basically realized, okay, there's all of these, these anti-war protesters, these young folk. I'm never going to win their vote. This is right after the Civil Rights Movement. Nixon realizes, okay, I'm probably not going to win the black vote. So who does he target? He targets conservative Southern whites to make that the backbone of the Republican Party. He calls those people the silent majority. Like, these angry young protesters, they're on TV every day, but the real silent majority are the Southern white people who just want to hold on to their traditional lives. Well, what did Nixon do? He attacked the press. He said the press was the enemy of the state and we're liberals. Sounds like Trump. He also slowed down integration of schools in the South, slowing down civil rights progress in the South, just to win the votes of white Southern voters. And this does become a strategy of the Republican Party all the way through today, where the Republican Party oftentimes targets conservative whites, whereas the Democratic Party oftentimes is more popular with a more diverse swath of peoples. Nixon is most famous, or most infamous, I suppose, for his involvement in the Watergate scandal. Watergate was a hotel in Washington, D.C. It doesn't look like much today, but the Watergate was a hotel in D.C., and it was also the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee. In 1972, right before the election, several people hired by Richard Nixon's re-election campaign broke into the Democratic headquarters at Watergate, and they installed spying equipment, wiretapped their phones, put in microphones, things like that. This was somewhat common for Nixon. Nixon also wiretapped government employees. He had a list of enemies that he would oftentimes target or investigate. But this was, this was not only breaking and entering, it's also spying on a political enemy, which the US isn't supposed to do. That's what Hitler and Stalin do. The US isn't supposed to do that, or at least so we tell ourselves. Eventually, the Washington Post, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, two of the great investigative journalists of the last 50 years, the Washington Post discovers this. They get an inside government source nicknamed Deep Throat, who was an FBI director at the time. And the Washington Post, the media, they slowly begin to uncover and slowly begin to unravel this plot, this break-in, and then the government cover-up. And it turns out Richard Nixon did not authorize the break-in at first. He might not even have known about the break-in, but after the break-in happened, he knew, and he was actively involved in covering it up. The smoking gun, if you will, was a tape recording. Richard Nixon was paranoid of his enemies, and he recorded most every conversation he had in the White House. And one of those recordings was of him talking with, I believe, his chief of staff, I could be wrong, about the break-in. And in this recording, President Nixon basically authorizes the cover-up. It's this little line here, all right, fine, all right, fine. Richard Nixon knew what was happening. So this tape tells us that President Nixon knew what was happening, and it tells us that he officially authorized the cover-up. This very quickly led to Nixon's resignation. He tried to fight with something called the, I believe it was called the Saturday Night Massacre. He fired a bunch of attorneys general and top government officials trying to install loyalists. Trump does something similar in 2020. He fights tooth and nail to stay into power. But eventually it became clear that the Republican controlled, his own party controls Congress. Eventually it became clear that he was going to be impeached, and that Congress had the votes to remove him. So he instead resigns in August of '74. His vice president will soon after pardon him for his crimes. So when we're talking about Watergate here, I'm going to say Nixon's team, because it wasn't him specifically, breaks in to the Democratic Party headquarters, and they install spying equipment. And the smoking gun tape reveals that Nixon covered up the scandal. So 1974, Nixon resigns, but is soon pardoned by his vice president. And so as we wrap up chapter 29, and there are some parts of chapter 29 that I didn't get to, Jimmy Carter especially, who I'll talk about with our last lecture. Chapter 29 is a story of the fall of the American Empire, or the beginning to fall of the American Empire, both militarily in Vietnam, at home as American people protest against the war, and then in the White House. The presidency is embroiled in this scandal that leads to their resignation. So again, chapter 29 is titled The Limits of a Superpower, and it truly is the limits of a superpower. The president cannot get away with everything. This horrible war in Vietnam that they lose, and protests of the American people demanding